Judge Nathaniel Stevens sat high behind his bench, looking down at the courtroom with a practiced gaze that never wavered. His job was to dispense justice swiftly and efficiently, and today's docket was no different from any other. A small traffic violation, a case that seemed trivial to most. But to Nathaniel, it was just another example of how order must be maintained. The courtroom, with its cold marble floors and high vaulted ceilings, echoed the power that Nathaniel wielded as a judge. He was the one who made the rules, who set the tone for the entire courtroom. The defendant, Angela Thompson, was called up to the stand. She was dressed simply, yet with an air of quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the usual nervous defendants he encountered. Angela was a black woman in her early 30s, with long, curly hair that framed her face. She had the kind of calm presence that made Nathaniel's practiced demeanor shift slightly, though he wouldn't admit it to anyone. He glanced at the case file in front of him, noting the accusation, running a red light. It seemed like a straightforward case. No one was hurt, no property was damaged. Just another minor infraction in a long line of similar cases. But as Angela stood there, patiently waiting for her turn to speak, something about her demeanor caught Nathaniel off guard. He was used to seeing defendants squirm, to hearing excuses about not seeing the light, or being in a rush. Yet Angela didn't make excuses. She simply stood tall, her gaze steady and unwavering as she addressed the judge. "I understand the charges, Your Honor," Angela said, her voice firm but respectful. "I admit I did run the light. But I wasn't speeding, and there was no one else on the road at the time. I had to make a quick decision due to an emergency at home. I'm not asking for special treatment. I just wanted to explain the circumstances." Nathaniel listened, his mind already made up. He was a man of rules and regulations, and there was no place for personal stories in his courtroom. Still, Angela's calmness made him pause for a moment longer than he was accustomed to. She wasn't pleading for leniency. She wasn't trying to manipulate the situation. She was simply presenting the facts as they were. "I appreciate your explanation, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice cool. "However, the law is clear. Running a red light is a violation, regardless of the circumstances. I'm afraid I must fine you the standard amount. This is a reminder to always follow traffic laws." Angela nodded, her face betraying no emotion. She wasn't happy with the outcome, but she accepted it. It wasn't her first encounter with the law, but something about this particular moment felt different. As the court session moved forward, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow misjudged her. Maybe it was the calm strength she carried, or perhaps the way she accepted the fine without protest. Whatever it was, it lingered in his mind as the proceedings continued. He had done his job, but in that brief interaction, something inside him had shifted, and he wasn't sure what it meant yet. He quickly dismissed the thought, returning to his role as a judge. There was no time for personal reflections when there were more cases to handle, but deep down, Nathaniel had the nagging feeling that today's case was far from ordinary. Later that evening, Nathaniel returned home to his modest but comfortable suburban house. The aroma of a freshly cooked meal drifted from the kitchen, signaling the end of a long day. He dropped his briefcase by the door and loosened his tie, hoping to unwind after the day's proceedings. Claire, his wife, was bustling around the kitchen, chopping vegetables for their dinner. She was always the one who took care of the little details, whether it was the decor, the meals, or keeping the house in perfect order. Nathaniel admired her for her calm efficiency, but tonight, something about her presence felt almost too perfect. Perhaps it was the lingering weight of the case he had just dealt with. "Hi, honey," Claire said, her voice warm and welcoming. "How was your day in court?" "It was fine," Nathaniel replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. He didn't want to think too much about the day's case, just the usual stuff, speeding tickets, a few minor offenses, nothing out of the ordinary. Claire smiled, though she could tell something was off. Nathaniel's usual confident demeanor seemed subdued, and his thoughts appeared far away. Before she could ask, she continued, "You'll be happy to know that Angela's coming over for dinner tonight. She called earlier, and I invited her to join us." Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. Angela. His mind immediately returned to the image of the defendant from earlier that day. The same woman he had found in court. Claire's best friend. He hadn't expected to encounter her again so soon. The realization hit him with an almost physical force. He froze, his hand still resting on the doorknob as his mind processed the connection. "Angela. Your best friend, Angela?" Nathaniel asked, his voice betraying more surprise than he intended. Claire glanced at him curiously. "Yes, that's right. You remember Angela, don't you? She's the one who helped me organize that charity event last year. You've met her a few times." She paused, noticing Nathaniel's slightly tense posture. "She's been going through a rough patch lately, and I thought it'd be nice to have her over." Nathaniel nodded, though his thoughts were racing. He tried to hide the shock that was evident on his face. Of all the people in Claire's life, Angela was the last person he would have expected to see on the other side of his courtroom. He had no idea that his wife's best friend was the same woman he'd just found. The thought made him uneasy, as if the boundaries between his professional life and personal life were suddenly blurred. Claire, oblivious to the storm of thoughts brewing inside her husband, continued preparing the meal. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, silently processing the collision of worlds. He had always prided himself on being impartial, seeing each case as simply a matter of the law. But now, with this new revelation, things felt much more complicated. He tried to push his discomfort aside, reminding himself that it was just dinner. After all, Claire and Angela had been friends for years. There was nothing to worry about. Yet, deep down, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's dinner would be far from ordinary. He wasn't just about to sit down with his wife and her friend. He was about to face the woman he had found earlier that day, the one whose life now seemed somehow entangled with his own. As he moved to set the table, his thoughts kept returning to Angela. Who was she really? And what had happened to the calm, composed defendant he'd seen in court? Tonight, he was about to find out. When Angela arrived, it was clear that she wasn't the same person Nathaniel had seen in the courtroom just hours before. She walked into the house with an easy smile, her laughter filling the space as Claire greeted her with a warm hug. Nathaniel stood up, his mind still trying to wrap around the situation, and forced a smile. "Angela, it's good to see you again," Nathaniel said, his voice a little strained, though he tried to keep it neutral. He extended his hand, but Angela's gaze flickered briefly over him, as if searching for something deeper. She shook his hand politely, but there was a faint tension in her eyes that Nathaniel couldn't quite place. "Good to see you too, Nathaniel," she replied, her voice warm but guarded. "Thanks for having me over." As the evening unfolded, Nathaniel couldn't shake the odd feeling that lingered in the air between them. Angela was every bit the person Claire had described, but there was something about her calmness that struck him differently now. When she spoke, her voice was steady, her eyes direct, and yet Nathaniel could sense an unspoken distance. Perhaps it was his own discomfort, knowing that he had just found this woman in his courtroom, or perhaps Angela knew exactly what had transpired and was silently processing it herself. They sat down for dinner, and conversation flowed more easily between Claire and Angela than it did with Nathaniel. It wasn't that Nathaniel didn't want to be part of the conversation. He just found himself preoccupied, his thoughts still tangled in the events of the day. Claire and Angela were deep in conversation about an upcoming fundraiser, laughing and exchanging stories from their past. Nathaniel tried to join in, but his mind kept drifting back to Angela's calm demeanor. How could someone so composed have found herself caught in a mundane traffic violation, one that he had so easily dismissed? He felt himself growing more introspective, wondering what Angela truly thought of him now. Did she feel humiliated, resentful, or was she, like the way she had appeared in court, just accepting it as another unavoidable part of life? He studied her across the table, noting the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke to him. She was polite, certainly, but Nathaniel could sense that she was holding something back, as if there was an invisible wall between them that he couldn't break down. At one point, Claire mentioned something about how Angela had been helping her with a personal project, a charity event for at-risk youth. Angela's passion for the cause shone through as she spoke. She was articulate, committed, and clearly deeply invested in the work she did. Nathaniel listened, intrigued by the depth of her involvement. This wasn't the same woman he had seen standing before him in court, caught in a mundane, technical violation of the law. This was someone who had a clear vision, someone who had a place in the world beyond the confines of a courtroom. The woman he had found was someone with a rich, meaningful life. As the evening wore on, Nathaniel began to feel a creeping sense of guilt. He had been so quick to dismiss her, so quick to enforce the law without considering the full picture. He hadn't even asked for her side of the story in a way that truly acknowledged her humanity. The fact that she was Claire's best friend only deepened the realization that he had been cold, perhaps even unfair, in his judgment. But instead of addressing it directly, Nathaniel stayed silent, the tension building in the space between them. Angela didn't bring up the fine, and neither did Claire. The air was thick with unspoken words, a momentary quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. What was Angela thinking? What would she say if she knew how Nathaniel truly felt about his earlier actions? As the dinner ended, Claire stood up to clear the table, but Nathaniel remained seated. His mind was heavy with the weight of what had happened, and he realized this dinner had been more than just a social gathering. It had been a moment of reckoning, and he wasn't sure what to do with the realization that, somehow, he had failed Angela before he even knew her. That night, after dinner, Nathaniel sat in his study, the quiet hum of the house surrounding him. Claire and Angela were in the living room, talking and laughing, but Nathaniel couldn't join them. His mind was still back in the courtroom, replaying the scene over and over again. He had done his job. He had followed the law, delivered the fine, and dismissed the case, but something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been too quick, too cold. His legal training, so deeply ingrained in him, had served as both a shield and a barrier, one that he'd relied on for years. Yet now, for the first time, he found himself questioning that shield. Sitting at his desk, Nathaniel stared at the papers in front of him, though he couldn't quite focus on them. His fingers drummed idly on the wood, his mind racing through the events of the evening. It wasn't just the dinner that had unsettled him. It was the conversation that hadn't happened. Angela hadn't said a word about the fine. Neither had Claire. It hung there, unsaid between them, a quiet elephant in the room. And Nathaniel couldn't help but wonder if Angela was silently processing the very thing he had so quickly dismissed. He thought about her calm demeanor in court, the way she had explained the circumstances of her violation without making excuses. There had been a sense of dignity about her, a quiet strength. She hadn't played the victim, hadn't tried to manipulate the situation to her advantage. She had simply presented the truth as she saw it, and Nathaniel, in his rush to uphold the law, had brushed it aside. In doing so, had he inadvertently diminished her? Had he seen her as just another defendant in a sea of cases, rather than as a person with her own complexities, her own story? His mind wandered back to the details of the case, running a red light in an empty intersection. A minor infraction, yes, but the context mattered. Angela wasn't some reckless driver. She wasn't even speeding. There had been an emergency, she had said, a reason for her actions. Nathaniel hadn't bothered to dig deeper, to ask the right questions. Instead, he had followed the rules to the letter, without considering that sometimes the letter of the law wasn't enough to capture the whole picture. As the minutes ticked by, Nathaniel's discomfort grew. He reached for the phone on his desk, staring at it for a long moment before dialing Angela's number. It rang a few times before she picked up. "Hello." Her voice was warm, but there was a hesitation in it, as if she had known this call might be coming. "Angela, it's Nathaniel," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a hint of vulnerability. "I've been thinking about today, about the case. And I want to apologize." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and Nathaniel immediately regretted his abruptness. But before he could backpedal, Angela spoke. "Apologize? For what?" Nathaniel took a deep breath. "I didn't handle it well. In court, I mean. I didn't give you the space to explain yourself fully, and I didn't take the time to understand what you were going through. I just find people and move on. But I realize now I treated you like just another case, instead of seeing you as a person." Angela was quiet for a moment, and Nathaniel's stomach twisted with uncertainty. Had she been waiting for this call, or was she surprised that he even cared enough to reach out? Finally, she spoke. "I appreciate your honesty, Nathaniel," she said gently. "But I understand why you did it. You're a judge. You have to follow the rules. It's just, I've been in situations before where people didn't give me the benefit of the doubt. I guess I'm just used to it." Nathaniel's heart tightened. That's exactly it. I shouldn't have just followed the rules. I should have seen you as more than just a name on a docket. You didn't deserve that. He could almost hear Angela nodding on the other end, her calm strength still present. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm not mad, Nathaniel, but I'm glad you're thinking about it." For the first time that evening, Nathaniel felt a small sense of relief. He had done something right. He hadn't just apologized. He had acknowledged his mistake, and in doing so, he had taken the first step toward understanding Angela as a person, not as a case, not as a defendant, but as a woman with her own life, her own challenges, her own dignity. The conversation ended with a quiet promise from both of them. They would do better, they would listen more closely, and they would try to understand one another, no matter the circumstances. It was a small victory, but for Nathaniel, it was the beginning of something much bigger than any courtroom could contain. The next morning, Nathaniel woke up with a new sense of purpose. The conversation with Angela had weighed heavily on him, but in the best way possible. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was seeing beyond the surface of his role as a judge, beyond the rigid framework of the law. He had spent so many years living by the rulebook, never questioning it, always seeking to balance the scales without ever considering the personal lives that hung in the balance. But Angela's case, her story, had cracked through that armor. And now he couldn't ignore it. As the day went on, Nathaniel found himself preoccupied, unable to focus fully on his duties. He kept replaying the moments from last night, the way Angela had handled his apology with such grace, the calm but firm way she had expressed that she wasn't angry, that she understood his position. Despite the heaviness of the conversation, there had been a sense of understanding between them, a kind of mutual respect that transcended the courtroom and the rules of law. By midday, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. Apologizing over the phone had been a start, but it wasn't enough. He had to make it right, not just for Angela, but for himself. He needed to confront the discomfort he had been avoiding for so long, the notion that the law, in its inflexibility, often overlooked the complexities of the people it was meant to serve. Nathaniel knew what he had to do. He called his assistant and arranged to have Angela's case reviewed again. He wanted to go beyond just reducing her fine. This wasn't about being lenient or doing her a favor. It was about acknowledging the circumstances she had faced, the decision she had made under duress, and most importantly, the humanity he had failed to see in the courtroom. At the end of the workday, Nathaniel made his way home, the weight of his decision still heavy on his shoulders. He felt the need to talk to Claire before he went through with it. His wife had always been his sounding board, his voice of reason when his emotions were clouding his judgment. But as he stepped into the living room, he was met with an unexpected sight. Angela was there, sitting on the couch with Claire. The two women were chatting animatedly, laughing over something they had been discussing. The room felt lighter than it had the previous evening, but Nathaniel could still sense the undercurrent of tension, the invisible thread that connected him to Angela in ways he wasn't quite prepared for. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach the situation now that it had moved into his personal space. Claire noticed him standing in the doorway and smiled warmly. "You're home early," she remarked. "We were just talking about the charity event Angela's helping with. She's really been pouring her heart into it." Nathaniel nodded and stepped into the room, trying to keep his emotions in check. "That's great," he said, forcing a smile. "I've been thinking about our conversation from last night, Angela." Angela looked up at him, her face softening. "Oh, what about it?" Nathaniel took a deep breath, his voice steady but sincere. "I wanted to apologize again for what happened in court. I've been reflecting on it a lot, and I realize now that I didn't see the bigger picture. I didn't give you the space to explain your circumstances fully, and I let the rules guide me without considering the person standing in front of me." There was a brief silence as Angela absorbed his words. Her expression didn't change much, but there was something in her eyes that Nathaniel hadn't seen before, a flicker of something deeper, maybe gratitude or understanding. "You don't need to keep apologizing," she said softly. "I know you were just doing your job. But I appreciate that you're reflecting on it. That means a lot." Nathaniel nodded, relieved that she wasn't angry or dismissive, but he wasn't done yet. "I've decided to reduce your fine," he continued. "I'm reviewing the case again, and I'm going to take into account the circumstances you were dealing with. You deserve more than just a slap on the wrist. You deserve fairness, and I want to make sure you get that." Angela's eyes widened slightly, surprised by his gesture. I don't know what to say," she murmured. Claire, who had been quietly watching the exchange, smiled warmly at both of them. "That's the Nathaniel I know. Always trying to do the right thing, even when it's difficult." Angela looked from Claire to Nathaniel, her expression softening. "Thank you. Really, I didn't expect this, but I'm grateful." Nathaniel felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it wasn't just because of the decision he had made. It was because he had done the right thing, not just for Angela, but for himself as well. He had acknowledged his mistake, taken action to correct it, and in doing so, he had learned something about the power of empathy and fairness. As he stood there, looking at the two women who had become unexpectedly intertwined in his life, Nathaniel realized that his world had shifted. The law was still important, but it was only a part of the larger picture. It was time to start seeing the whole story. The days that followed felt different for Nathaniel. He couldn't quite explain it, but he was more aware of the people around him, more aware of their stories, their struggles, and the way his decisions impacted their lives. Every case that came across his desk seemed to have new meaning now. The law, he realized, wasn't just a set of rules to be followed mechanically. It was a living, breathing thing that affected real people, and he, in his position, held the power to shape the outcomes of their lives. Angela's case had opened his eyes, but it was more than just a lesson in empathy. It was a lesson in humility. He had made a mistake, and admitting that had been harder than he'd anticipated, but once he did, he felt lighter. As if, by acknowledging the humanity of those he judged, he could release some of the weight that had been placed on him for so long. One evening, a few days after his decision to revisit Angela's case, Nathaniel sat down with Claire at dinner, reflecting on the shift he had felt inside himself. Angela had accepted his offer to reduce her fine, and though she had been grateful, Nathaniel felt a sense of unease still lingering. Had he truly done enough, or was this gesture just another way of him trying to right an old wrong? "You've seemed more at peace lately," Claire observed as she passed him the bread basket. She had noticed the subtle change in him, the way he approached both his work and their home life with a newfound calmness. "I guess I've been thinking a lot about my role as a judge," Nathaniel admitted, his voice thoughtful. "It's not just about enforcing the law anymore. It's about understanding the people in front of me. And I think I need to be more than just a figure behind the bench." Claire looked at him, her expression softening. "You've always been a good man, Nathaniel. But I think you're right. The world isn't as simple as following the letter of the law. Sometimes you have to see the bigger picture." He nodded, grateful for her understanding. It's just that I didn't realize how much I was missing before. When Angela came into my court that day, I didn't see her as a person. I saw her as a case, and that's something I never want to do again." Just as Nathaniel finished his sentence, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, expecting a work-related message, but instead, it was a text from Angela. It read, "I just wanted to thank you again for what you did. Your gesture really meant a lot to me, and I'm glad we had that conversation. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but I appreciate it." Nathaniel smiled as he read the message. It felt good to know that he had made the right choice. But beyond that, it reminded him that his apology and actions had made a real difference in someone else's life. He wasn't just a judge who handed down fines. He was a human being who had the ability to influence others in profound ways. As the evening went on, Nathaniel reflected on how much he had learned from the experience. His relationship with Angela had transformed, but so had his relationship with Claire. His wife had always been his anchor, the one person who kept him grounded. And now she was witnessing the evolution of a man who had spent years hiding behind the walls of his profession. Nathaniel knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He was still a judge, and the law would always be at the core of what he did. But he also understood now that the law didn't exist in a vacuum. It was interwoven with the lives of the people who came before him. People with stories, feelings, and reasons for their actions. He had a duty not just to uphold the law, but to see those stories for what they were, to honor them. That night, as he sat with Claire, the weight of his past decisions and the future ones he would make felt less daunting. He no longer saw himself as just a figure of authority, but as a man who could grow, change, and learn. The path ahead might be uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just a judge. He was someone who would listen, someone who would try harder to see the world through others' eyes. And that, he believed, was the beginning of true justice. The weeks following Nathaniel's reflection felt like a quiet revolution in his life. His approach to the courtroom had subtly shifted. He wasn't just handing down sentences. He was listening more closely, paying attention to the context of each case, and considering the lives of those standing before him. Yet, as much as he wanted to hold on to this newfound perspective, he knew it would be put to the test soon enough. One Thursday afternoon, a case came across Nathaniel's desk that, for all its simplicity, made him pause. A young man, just 22 years old, had been caught in a hit-and-run accident. The details were sketchy, but the facts were clear. The man had been speeding through a residential area when he struck a parked car and fled the scene. The police had tracked him down quickly, but the damage was already done. The man had pleaded guilty to all charges, and he was facing a hefty fine and possible jail time. As Nathaniel read through the case files, something about it felt familiar, too familiar. He saw the name of the young man, Marcus Delaney. It didn't take long for him to realize the connection. Marcus was the younger brother of an old friend, someone Nathaniel had known for years, back in his early days of law school. Marcus had always been trouble, even as a teenager. Nathaniel remembered the reckless behavior, the drinking, and the trouble that had followed Marcus through his youth. But this was different. This wasn't just a case of youthful rebellion. Someone had been hurt, and Marcus had left the scene without so much as a second thought. Nathaniel sat back in his chair, conflicted. He had always prided himself on being impartial, able to separate his personal feelings from his professional obligations. But now, confronted with this man, a young man he had once watched grow up, who had made such a destructive choice, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. He thought about Angela, about their conversation, about how he had promised himself that he would do better, be better. But here was Marcus, someone he knew, someone whose mistakes hit closer to home. Could he maintain the objectivity he had promised to uphold? Nathaniel sat in silence for a long moment, weighing his options. He could easily ignore the personal connection and proceed as he always had. He could follow the law to the letter, impose the fine, and let the legal system run its course. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this young man, standing at the crossroads of his future, needed something more. He needed a chance, just like he himself had needed years ago when he had made mistakes as a younger man. Suddenly, Nathaniel found himself picking up the phone and dialing Marcus's public defender. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he needed to speak with someone before making any decisions. When the lawyer answered, Nathaniel explained that he wanted to meet with Marcus before the case went to trial. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the courthouse for their meeting. He was nervous, fidgeting in his seat as Nathaniel studied him. The young man's once cocky demeanor had vanished, replaced by a sense of uncertainty and regret. "Nathaniel, I don't know what I was thinking," Marcus began, his voice shaky. "I screwed up. I shouldn't have run. I'm sorry. I panicked." Nathaniel took a breath and nodded. "I understand that," he said, keeping his tone steady. "But you have to understand that running from the accident doesn't just make it harder for you. It makes it harder for everyone involved." Marcus looked down, ashamed. "I know. I don't know what came over me. I didn't think about the consequences, but I want to make things right. I know I can't take back what I did, but I want to try and fix it." Nathaniel watched him carefully, considering his words. He wasn't sure where the conversation would go, but he knew one thing. Marcus had admitted to his mistake. He wasn't offering excuses. He was taking responsibility. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was a young man who could still turn his life around if given the right guidance. When the meeting ended, Nathaniel walked back to his office, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He had always believed that the law should be an impartial force. But now, after everything he had learned, he wasn't so sure. The law, in its rigidity, sometimes overlooked the potential for redemption, for second chances. He sat at his desk, deep in thought, knowing that the decision ahead would be one of the most difficult of his career. He would have to balance the law with compassion, and that was no easy task. But, as he had learned from Angela and his own journey, sometimes the right decision wasn't the one that followed the letter of the law to the letter. It was the one that considered the person behind the case. Nathaniel knew, as he looked at Marcus's case once again, that the path ahead would not be simple. But for the first time, he felt confident that he was ready to face it with the understanding and empathy that he had long denied. Nathaniel spent the next few days wrestling with his decision. Marcus Delaney's case had shaken him in a way that no other case had. He felt an obligation, not just as a judge, but as a person who understood the complexity of human mistakes. He knew that upholding the law was crucial, but he also knew that law wasn't just about punishment. It was about balance, fairness, and the potential for growth. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was filled with the usual bustle, lawyers reviewing notes, witnesses waiting their turn, and the soft hum of murmured conversations. Nathaniel sat at the bench, his gavel in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't just preparing to hear the facts. He was preparing to make a decision that would affect Marcus's life, and perhaps his own. As Marcus stood in the defendant's box, his shoulders slumped in the weight of his guilt, Nathaniel saw something in him that he hadn't expected: vulnerability. Marcus wasn't the defiant young man he had once known. He was a young man broken by his own poor choices, trying to navigate the consequences of them. The prosecutor outlined the charges: hit and run, speeding, endangering public safety, each one landing like a hammer on the case. The defense lawyer spoke of Marcus's troubled background, his past mistakes, and his sincere regret for what had happened. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, his voice trembled, but his words were steady. "I know what I did was wrong," he said, his eyes downcast. "I ran, and that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. But I don't want to let that one mistake define me. I want to make up for it. I want to show that I can be better." Nathaniel felt a deep pang of empathy. He had seen young people make mistakes, even his younger self, and the fear of judgment had often made things worse. But Marcus wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't pleading for leniency. He was asking for a chance to prove he could do better. When the room fell silent, Nathaniel cleared his throat and looked at Marcus, then the prosecutor, then the defense. He didn't feel like he was playing a role as a judge anymore. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something important, something that could change both Marcus's life and his own. After a long moment of reflection, Nathaniel made his decision. "Marcus Delaney," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "You have made a grave mistake, but I see that you understand the severity of your actions. This is not a case of a person who doesn't care about the consequences of their behavior. You've shown remorse, and you've taken responsibility. But actions have consequences, and the law must be upheld." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "I'm sentencing you to community service for the next 6 months, alongside a reduced fine, but with a mandate to attend counseling and rehabilitation. I'm also going to arrange for you to meet with a mentor, someone who has walked this path before, and who can help guide you through the process of turning your life around." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom. The prosecutor looked stunned, and the defense lawyer blinked in disbelief, but Marcus's face broke into a hesitant, yet grateful smile. His relief was palpable, and Nathaniel felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing he had given the young man something that went beyond just the penalty. He had given him the possibility of redemption. As the court session ended, Nathaniel sat back in his chair, reflecting on the path he had just chosen. He had taken a risk, one that was far from guaranteed to lead to success, but he believed it was the right one. It wasn't about leniency, it was about fairness, compassion, and the potential for growth. When Nathaniel returned home that evening, Claire was waiting for him. She could tell by the way he carried himself that something had changed. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked, knowing him better than anyone. "I did," Nathaniel replied, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "And it wasn't easy, but it felt right." Claire smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you. I knew you were capable of this kind of change." Nathaniel nodded, but he wasn't just proud of the decision he had made. He was proud of the man he had become. The past few weeks had been transformative. He had learned to see beyond the black and white of the law, and to consider the nuances of human behavior. He realized now that justice wasn't always about exacting punishment. It was about understanding, about recognizing when someone needed a second chance, and when the law could help, rather than hurt, that person's future. As he sat down at the dinner table with Claire, a sense of peace settled over him. He had made mistakes, he had learned from them. And now he was able to make a difference, not just in the lives of those who stood before him in court, but in his own life as well. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Nathaniel felt that he was walking down the right path, one of understanding, compassion, and true justice.